Welcome to today's webinar, Reception and Placement Orientation Assessment. I'm Sanya Bebic, the Director of Refugee and Immigrant Integration Programs at the Center for Applied Linguistics, and I am joined today for this webinar by my colleague Julie Sugarman, who is an evaluation specialist at the Center for Applied Linguistics. Before we go into the content of the webinar, just a few words about the structure of today's webinar. After a brief introduction, I will say a few words about the steps and the building blocks that led to the development of the R&P CO assessment. And then Julie will walk us through the three components of the R&P CO assessment. After that, I will talk briefly about the next steps for the development of resources that Cal is working on this year, as well as the finalizing of the assessment toolkit in the coming weeks. And then we will have ample time for question and answer at the end of the webinar. To say a few words about the broader context in which we were doing our work, and we continue to do our work on not only on the R&P CO assessment, but the other resources that Cal has been working on and we continue to work on, and that is the context of the CO continuum. By that I mean the continuum starting with pre-departure orientation overseas, where the seed is planted, and continuing through R&P orientation domestically and then beyond R&P orientation. So to talk about building block one, kind of where the process started for the CO Objectives and Indicators project, we started with the goal working with the CO working group and PRM, the goal of strengthening orientation throughout the CO continuum. And the question we asked is, what do refugees need to know to successfully resettle in terms of knowledge, skills, and attitudes before resettlement and during the R&P period? Obviously, all of this in the context of effective orientation provision. We ended up with two documents. One, the Overseas CO Objectives and Indicators document, and the second one, the domestic, focused on R&P orientation, CO Objectives and Indicators document. We developed these documents to a large extent in order to establish clarity regarding CO messages, both overseas and domestically, and then also to facilitate the continuum between overseas and domestic orientation. Very often domestic refugee service providers wonder about what exactly is covered and how in overseas orientation, and our overseas colleagues often have the same questions about post-arrival orientation, R&P orientation, and beyond that. So one of the important purposes of these two documents is to kind of codify those basic messages of orientation, both overseas and domestically, so that we all know wherever, regardless of where we stand on the CO continuum, what basic messages and essential messages are being communicated to refugees, whether it's overseas or domestically. And another really important purpose for these documents is to guide the development of resources. One example of that is the Welcome to the U.S. Orientation Kit, which is aligned with the CO Objectives and Indicators documents. Another more recent example of a resource that Cal worked on is the Reception and Placement Orientation Curriculum, which was completed in late 2013. And then the assessment, the R&P CO assessment that we will be discussing today, is another example. Later this year, calendar year 2014, Cal will produce a training of trainers manual and instructional video for refugee orientation, and all of those will be aligned with the Objectives and Indicators documents as well. So how are these documents to be used? to full documents, whether it's overseas or domestic objectives and indicators, includes knowledge, skills, and attitudes to be conveyed to refugees during orientation. Then, as I mentioned, they were also used to design the welcome book and the R&P CO curriculum. And these documents reflect what should be taught, not what should or can be assessed. And Julie will say more about that during her part of the webinar. So as I mentioned, this is just a visual of the reception and placement orientation curriculum, which is on the CAL website. And if you look at the contents of the curriculum, you will see that the units, the list of units, is aligned with the broad topics of the objectives and indicators document, the broad topics and the broad topics of the welcome book of the welcome book. So now I will turn it over to Julie to walk us through the 3 components of the assessment toolkit: the Model CO assessment, instructions for the use of the Model CO assessment, and then the more general how to background document that answers what we anticipate will be some frequently asked questions about CO assessment for refugees.
So as Sonia mentioned, I'll be discussing the Model CO assessment primarily today. The overall assessment toolkit has 3 components: the Model CO assessment, the instructions for that model assessment, and then a general how-to document. This will be an online document that provides more detail on some of the topics we're going to discuss today, looking at how does the model assessment fit into the bigger picture of looking at the effectiveness of cultural orientation. And it provides some suggestions for how to do monitoring and evaluation of CO, so in a little bit more of a broad sense. And it's intended for people who don't have experience in monitoring and evaluation, so it gives you some background information about concepts related to monitoring and evaluation. The model assessment that we're going to discuss today has 11 questions. It assesses understanding of CO concepts in a broad way. It will be translated into major languages, and it's one tool that may be used by agencies to evaluate the effectiveness of CO. As Sonia mentioned, there may be other tools that you already have or are developing that work, and so you can definitely use those because this tool that we've developed may not be useful in all circumstances. The frequently asked questions, the how-to document, will provide guidance on developing some of those sorts of tools. So this is a sample of one of the questions. Happens to be question number 7. What are 2 things a refugee can do to become employed? I'll show you an example that's filled out in just a moment, but you'll see the 2 spaces for responses and then 1 for prompts, which I'll show you in just a minute. Underneath each question, there's some extra information about scoring or about administering the particular question. So again, this question is, what are 2 things a refugee can do to become employed? And the guidelines are, if the refugee's response is too general, they say, oh, I'll go to the agency. Or it's related but not directly tied to becoming employed, like learn English or meet some American people, you can prompt, can you think of anything else? And for this question, not just for the prompt, but in general, the participant may indicate steps towards finding a job or becoming employable. So here's an example of what the participants might say. So you may ask the question, what are 2 things a refugee can do to become employed? And maybe the first thing they say is look at job advertisements online, and that would be correct. So you mark the correct answer. And then maybe the second thing they say is learn English, and that's one of those things that is close. It's technically true, but it's not really something to become employed. So you mark the prompt and ask, can you think of anything else? And the third thing that they come up with is ask people in the community if they know of any jobs. So, and maybe that item is so that item is correct. So you have a half a point for the first correct and a half point for the second correct, as it says at the bottom, give half a point for each correct answer. And then you have 1 point altogether because they did correctly give two items, two things a refugee can do to become employed. So all of the 11 questions have a similar format. Some of them have prompts and some don't. We'll talk about that a little bit in more detail in just a few minutes. And the instructions about how to prompt and how to mark for correct or mark for prompt or incorrect is in the instruction document that I mentioned earlier. So that for whoever is going to be doing the assessment, if they have that instruction sheet, that should help clarify how to do that process. So the questions on the model assessment are based on indicators from the domestic or R&P CO objectives and indicators. The selection of questions that ended up on the model assessment were ones that were critical to survival. They sampled a broad range of CO topics, and they were topics that we could create valid questions about. So something that's meaningful, non-ambiguous, and closely related to the indicator of interest. And ambiguity ended up being an issue in developing these questions because for some questions the only way to avoid ambiguity was to make them so specific that they were leading questions, or they might not apply across individual or local contexts. So it was, because some of these concepts are so broad, it was sometimes very difficult to create a question that wasn't ambiguous but was also not so specific that it might not apply to everybody. So we're going to talk about these concepts of assessment purpose, design, and use. The assessment purpose is what you want to know. Why are you giving this assessment, or the information that you hope to get out of it? The assessment design is the format and types of questions that you ask. The format being, should this assessment be oral or written? Should it have open-ended questions or multiple choice? Those are those sorts of decisions. Then the types of questions are, how hard should the questions be? Or how broad or how narrow should the questions be? So those are all of the things, or some of the things that go into the assessment design. In terms of assessment use, that's what decisions you'll make with the data, or what decisions you'll make as a result of interpreting the findings. So questions like, will you make decisions about individuals, or about a particular class, or about a program? Are you going to be making decisions for monitoring, and those decisions tend to be, this is okay or not okay? Or are you making decisions about program improvement? So these three things need to really all be considered together when you are creating an assessment. And a lot of the decisions that we made about the design had to do with the purpose and the use, and that's what I'm going to go through right now. First, the purpose of the Model CO assessment is to ensure that all refugees are able to demonstrate basic competencies, and to be able to identify groups of refugees that are not able to demonstrate basic competencies, if there are any. This might be people who receive a certain type of CO, or a certain ethnic or linguistic group. So if you're looking at the scores and comparing these groups and seeing that one group is not doing as well as another, that's information that you can get from this assessment. You would then use that information to make CO better in a targeted way for particular groups of participants. So you'll know who it is that is having trouble. You may need to do some additional investigation, but at least you will have a starting point to know how to approach improving your CO program. So the Model CO assessment was designed to be administered to one participant at a time, orally. Both the questions and the answers are spoken aloud. Once per participant, in one sitting, meaning you do all 11 questions at once, and at the completion of R&P CO. We're going to talk about the last 3 points in just a minute, but I first will talk a little bit more about the first two issues. The open-ended oral interview format was chosen because it provides participants maximum opportunities to demonstrate what they know. It elicits correct answers through prompts and partial credit. It allows for a range of correct answers depending on individual or local circumstances. And it's an easy to understand format for participants who may be unfamiliar with Western testing practices. So all of these were important considerations because of the very wide range of contexts in which this assessment might be administered, and because the concepts we're interested in are so broad. A group administration giving this assessment as it's designed now, giving it to a whole group or giving it as a written assessment doesn't allow for clarifications or prompts. To do a written assessment, questions would need to be narrower and more specific, and then we run into the issue of having the assessment be relevant across contexts. So you see how that decision-making process to do an oral open-ended format was because of the context that we have in terms of so many different kinds of programs and so many different kinds of refugees that might be taking the assessment. The intended uses of the model CO assessment are to demonstrate the effectiveness of CO in the short term, meaning understanding and retention of concepts, or to indicate a need for overall program improvement. And then also to point to areas for further investigation, topics, populations, program implementation models, as I mentioned before, that you may be looking at scores and comparing groups. So looking at the different ways that people are, the patterns in the scores. We'll talk about that again in a second. Thinking about the demonstration of effectiveness in the short term, you might come out with a statement like X participants scored at Y level or above. So a typical way of looking at an average score is looking at how many people scored above a certain benchmark. Now, we don't know what those benchmarks are right now because we have no previous effort to assess CO learning or effectiveness to compare to. This is really the first time that an assessment like this is being used, so we really don't have any benchmarks or any starting place for considering what that, how many questions do you need to get right in order to, think in terms of having it be a good outcome, or how many people need to have that good outcome. That's something that we may be able to develop over time, is certainly something that we are continuing to think about as people start to use this assessment. Again, thinking about areas for further investigation, you might have findings like 90% of participants got question in X incorrect, or participants from X ethnic group have an average score of 6.8 compared to an overall average of 9.5. And of course, I'm just totally making those numbers up. Participants who participated in the XYZ program outscored those who participated in the ABC program by 2 to 1. Those are the kinds of statements you might write in a report about your outcomes. Now, none of these findings by itself is definitive because you need to know why those things happened. There may be something inadequate in the instruction. There may be something unrelated to CO that is a reason why a particular group didn't do well. Or there might be something wrong with the test or with a question that people really did know the information but weren't able to get that across. So just having the information of how people did, or even the comparison groups, is one step. But then you have to really think carefully about what does that mean and what are you going to do as a result. Coming back to the idea of having a single administration in one sitting at the end of R&P, I wanted to mention that the design does not preclude multiple administrations. So there's nothing about the way the test is formatted or the questions that makes it impossible or technically unwise to give that assessment more than once. But the assessment really isn't robust enough to inform what to reteach. The reason that you might want to give it more than once is to see, oh gosh, the people in this group didn't really understand this concept, so I'm going to reteach that. And this assessment doesn't really get at any one topic area in a robust enough way because there's really only one question in most areas. And this assessment is about CO overall. So you technically could provide it more than once, but it really isn't. I'm not sure what useful information you would get out of doing that. So a single end-of-program assessment provides information about CO in its entirety and whether people are getting the message overall. Now, of course, you can feel free to use any of these questions if you're designing your own assessment, or use different questions at different times, but this is what all of these sort of do this and don't do that, things that I'm telling you are really, again, thinking about this connection between the purpose, the use, and the design. There's lots of other ways you can do things, but just so that you understand sort of what the foundation of the assessment that we have created is, and can use it and will have valid findings from it. Some things to be aware of regarding use and design. The test must be administered in roughly the same way at the same point in time for each participant if you want to average the scores of multiple participants and compare average scores across participant groups and over time. So we talked about how there's some prompts and there's some clarifications that can be made. So this assessment is not exactly a standardized test like you might remember from school, but you can create consistency at the local level by having assessors talk to each other about how they score and always giving the assessment under the same circumstances. And we're going to talk a little bit about what that means in just a minute. Another consideration is that the easier the test is, the less useful the test data is for comparisons, but it may still be useful for demonstrating basic competencies. So you may find that because we're looking at basic competencies, a really large proportion of your refugees score very high, and that's a great outcome. That's really what we want to see, that people are understanding the basic information and are able to demonstrate that they understand that. So it's like a driver's license test, in effect. We're not really terribly interested in the details of who gets what correct or incorrect. So there really aren't questions in here intended to trick anybody so that only the smartest get it right, like you might have in the SAT or something like that. This is really about wanting everybody to be successful and to eventually get all of the information so that they could get all 11 questions correct. But then if everyone does get 100%, you can't really compare across subgroups because there's really nothing to compare because Group A got 100 and Group B got 100. But that's not really the design of this assessment. A little bit more detail on that to come here in the next slide. Some things that the Model CO assessment was not designed to do, and this is what I was just talking about. It's not designed to show which participants exceed basic competencies and develop high levels of understanding of CO concepts. There aren't any questions on the assessment that ask about more complex concepts, some of which are in the objectives and indicators, because they are things that can and should be taught. And there's no extra credit for more sophisticated responses. So if you were looking for an assessment that really got into the details of who is moving beyond the basic competencies and developing a really sophisticated understanding, this assessment probably would not help you get that information, but there are other ways you can create an assessment in order to get that information. Another thing it's not designed to do is, and I mentioned this earlier, to indicate which broad CO topics, like education or health, should undergo curricular revision. However, the results may point to areas for further investigation. You may see if lots of people are getting one particular question wrong, there may be something about that whole topic that is a message that's not getting through, and so that's an indicator to you to, oh, you know, we need to find out some more and maybe do a little bit more assessment in this area and see if it's just that question or if it really is the whole topic that people are not understanding. Now, of course, if someone gets something wrong, an instructor may want to reteach the specific concept covered in the question because, of course, it is, you know, when you ask a specific question and they get it wrong, that is something that you can assume they don't understand. So that is something that you can do with the assessment. Another thing the assessment wasn't designed to do was to label individuals as passing or failing, although it may be used to flag individuals who require additional support. Now, there really isn't enough information about what a passing or a failing would be if those concepts are even relevant. It would be theoretically possible to study how scores on this assessment correlate to some broader measure of success, but we don't have that information at this time. Now, I don't think anybody is going to be using this assessment to make any high-stakes decisions about individuals. Personally, I also work in the K-12 world and in education for younger people, and this is something that we think about a lot, is using assessments. Is this an appropriate assessment to use for a particular purpose? And so that's really why I'm making this point that the assessment is not robust enough to sort of put a label on a person, although again I don't think you would actually do that. But of course this is a really good indicator of who needs support. So if someone doesn't do well, that's, you know, and you want to give them additional support, that's definitely something that we want to result from having given the assessment. And the last thing that the assessment was not designed to do is to demonstrate the long-term impact of CO. Again, it's theoretically possible to correlate this assessment with long-term success, but that's tricky because there are so many other variables that affect success. So it's definitely something that we're thinking about in terms of how do we connect short-term outcomes of people understood the concepts to the long-term. It is important to know whether people understood the information in the short term, because if you teach something to somebody and they didn't understand it, or they can't demonstrate it back to you, then it's probably unlikely they'll be able to, in 3 months or 6 months, use that information when they need it. So that short-term outcome is really important to keep an eye on, because that is sort of the basis for knowing if the information they were given helps them in the long term, which of course is our ultimate goal. Now, I have been talking about ways that the assessment was designed and things that are guidelines for you and how you should use it. There are some areas where the assessment is adaptable. One thing is in terms of using locally relevant terms. So there's a question on how do you use, and then in parentheses, name of local transportation system. So here in DC, we would say, how do you use the metro? In San Francisco, you might say, how do you use BART? So whatever the locally relevant term is in that kind of a question, you can insert that where indicated. It also can be administered in English or in other languages. We will be translating this into a number of the major languages. But this is one of the reasons why having a lot of flexibility made sense, because it already was not a standardized test, because everybody wouldn't be reading the exact same questions that were written in English. They would be reading translations. So that provided an opportunity for really sort of allowing for this to be tailored to different needs. Now, speaking of reading the questions verbatim, once you do have translation, questions should be read verbatim, should be read as written, with substitutions only as indicated, such as names of local institutions. But prompts do not need to be read verbatim. So if someone is not understanding a concept or a word, you can help them in any way that you need to make sure that they understand the concept. Now you have to be sort of careful not to give away the answers, but we definitely don't want anybody to get a question wrong because they didn't understand the question or they didn't know a word in the question or anything like that. So you can rephrase or define vocabulary to ensure comprehension. The other area where this is adaptable is in terms of exactly how the assessment is administered. Who is assessed? Who conducts the assessment in terms of what kind of personnel? How many people are assessed? When are participants assessed? Of course, the guideline that we have suggested is at the end of the R&P period. So there's a little bit of a guideline in there, but you know, should it be exactly at day 60 or day 75 or day 30, or, you know, it's really whatever the end of R&P is for you. Another question is, how are data stored, analyzed, and shared, and what additional data are collected to contextualize findings? All of these decisions are decisions to be made by the agency, maybe national headquarters or PRM. It's really, these things really have to do with how the information is going to be used. And a lot of these concepts are discussed in detail in the frequently asked questions that will be coming out. So if you want to know more about how do you decide about what additional data to collect to contextualize findings, there is a question on that. So all of that information, you will have more guidance on how to do that. I wanted to just say a few more words about prompts and correct and incorrect answers. The correct, incorrect prompt guidelines that are within the assessment and also on the instruction document are general, and they don't include all possible scenarios. Now, partial credit should only be awarded where indicated. Credit should not be awarded for answers that are close, although in many cases there are prompts that can be asked to allow respondents to be more specific or to try again. So we did think about really likely ways that participants might respond to the question that that really are not incorrect answers, but we'll just lay them aside and mark that as a prompt and then ask for another response or another detail or something like that. So in general, prompts are used if the participants misunderstood the question, or if their response is too vague, or if the participant indicates the question is not applicable to them. This last point is something that was included in the prompt guidelines in the model assessment, but we did not actually get a chance to include this explicitly on the instructions. So I wanted to provide an additional overall instruction, which is that participants may be given a prompt in any situation where their initial response is that the question is not applicable to them. We did this for some questions that we thought of that were very likely to have this situation, but some really amazing, wonderful feedback from our colleagues have provided some additional situations where that might come up, and we wanted to make sure that that was accounted for. For example, the question, what is one reason why it is important to learn English? Now this is worded in the abstract, so it's not meant to be what is one reason you, person sitting in front of me, should learn English. But in case they interpret it that way and they say, well, actually I already speak English, or whatever other thing they might say to that effect, you can go ahead and say something like, well, what's one reason why it's important for people in general to learn English? So again, we do provide some of those specific prompts, but the important thing is to think about the reasons for the prompts, which, as I'll just go back one slide, if the participant misunderstood, if the response is too vague, or if the participant indicates the question is not applicable. Those are really the situations where you would use a prompt, and if there's anything that comes up as you're giving the assessment, please do go ahead and use your best judgment in terms of asking additional prompts. Again, we don't want to give too many opportunities and unlimited chances because if someone really doesn't know something, we want that to be indicated in their score. But we want to make sure that people have a really fair chance to answer each question. And of course, we also want to hear feedback. Sonia's going to mention in a moment about feedback that we might be collecting in the short term, but if anything comes up, definitely let us know in terms of, a prompting situation that we didn't think of or something like that. We're very interested in hearing that information. So I'm going to turn it back to Sonia to give you a little bit more information about next steps. And then I'll still be here and we'll be taking questions when she's done.
Thank you, Julie. So as we wrap it up and talk about some of the next steps and the piloting of the assessment, I encourage you to type your questions in the chat box and we will address those next. So what will happen from here? First of all, as we mentioned, the assessment has 3 components, and 2 of those you have seen already. It is the model assessment and the guidelines for the use of the assessment. And the 3rd component is being finalized now, and that is the frequently asked questions document that Julie referred to in her part of the presentation, and that one will contain a lot of background information and looking at possible scenarios that may come up as you conduct the assessment and then work with the data that you gather from the assessment. So we anticipate finalizing that in the coming weeks, and we'll release it as we did with the R&P CO assessment through PRM and through your national headquarters. So we are looking at this assessment and at the R&P CO curriculum as well as really a work in progress. We all need to live with it for a while and use it for a while and then go back and ask some questions about what is working, what may not be working, how these can be strengthened. So as a first step in that direction, we will be working with the CO work group to identify a select number of agencies across networks, not a large number, but some number of agencies. We still need to determine how many that will be to be pilot sites for the assessment in the coming months. And that means that we will just ask you to think about some specific things and provide more comprehensive feedback to us in terms of how the administration, the scoring, etc. of the assessment is going. And then, as Julie mentioned, we would love to hear any general feedback you have, whether you are a pilot site or not, and that can be provided through headquarters. Each agency has a representative on the CO work group, which we work closely with, or to us directly. And the general address for the Core Center is cor@cal.org, but also I know that many of you have my address as well as bevic@cal.org, or your national headquarters note how to get in touch with us as well if you want to channel feedback through them. And then as we collect all of this feedback, we will take another look at the assessment this summer and make some decisions about things that may need to be tweaked and modified, and then maybe issue generation 2 of the assessment in late summer. So in terms of the broader context of R&P objectives and indicators, here are some things that are in progress and that will be happening over the course of 2014, calendar year 2014. So the R&P CO curriculum has been posted on our website. It was posted on our website in December, and it's called orientation.net. That will be on the last slide that I will put up towards the end of the webinar. And we are right now working with agencies, with your headquarters, to get hard copies, sample hard copies of the R&P curriculum to your national headquarters, and they will be distributing it to affiliates, 1 copy per affiliate, and if it's a joint site, it will also be 1 copy. And then as part of the rollout, we will be doing some presentations at some of the network conferences in the coming month, both on the R&P CO curriculum and the R&P CO assessment. With the CO assessment tools, as I mentioned, you have already seen 2 out of the 3 components, and the third one will be coming in the coming weeks. And Cal will also be translating the assessment, obviously not all languages at once. We will start with Arabic, Nepali, and Burmese, and then work with the CO work group and PRM to determine what other high priority languages may be. Obviously, if you want to use it immediately before we translate and post those translations on our website, and you have local resources, you're welcome to translate the assessment yourselves. In terms of additional work that Cal will be focused on this year to support all of these different pieces of the puzzle, we will be moving to do work on training of trainer resources for CO and this there will be a manual component, a book, TOT book, and then a training of trainers video, and this will incorporate components of both overseas CO and domestic CO, because many of the principles of effective orientation apply to both overseas and domestic CO provision. We will be sending out a needs assessment to agencies to ask some questions about what your needs and priorities on those topics may be, and that will go out in early March, and then we will proceed to develop those resources in the spring and the summer, and plan to release them later this year. In addition to that, we are working on compiling some supporting materials, for example, pulling out the different handouts, worksheets, visuals, etc. From the R&P CO curriculum, and grouping those in a toolkit, translating that, and posting it on our website so that you can have access to those resources and don't need to spend staff time and resources if you want to use those in your CO provision in different languages with different populations.